I'm Lee Schwartzberg, and we're here at the 7th Annual Community Oncology Conference in Las Vegas. This morning we had very interesting presentations about new developments in targeted therapies, breast cancer, and prostate cancer. And a couple of questions arose as we talked about these issues. The first is that with new biology and understanding that there are smaller groups of patients who might be benefiting from a particular targeted therapy, how do we get these patients into clinical trials? Understanding that clinical trials at best is a difficult proposition in the community setting. And then when we talk about the fantastic advances in diseases like prostate cancer, where so many new drugs have been developed, how do we integrate our clinical services so that all of the main members of the clinical team, the surgeon, the medical oncologist, and the radiation oncologist work together to deliver optimal care, particularly in an era where we have sequencing of many different types of therapies? So let me ask first Dr. Burris, if you could talk a little bit about the new era of clinical trials and how we're going to get this done.
So it's clear that, as Lee's alluded to, we're going to need to get the right answer more quickly, and that well-designed trials that involve dozens or hundreds of patients is the way of the future. We're going to need to have some stratification and some prognostic biomarkers go into those trials, predictive biomarkers, things that are going to help tell us whether the biologic being studied is going to be useful in that patient population. Too hard to look at it in arrears after the trial's been completed. So along that line, having a tissue collected at the beginning of the studies is going to be key, and designing the trial in such a way that we're going to be having that particular subset of patients studied, what will end up happening once the new agent reaches its regulatory approval.
And Judd, can you talk about how you do multidisciplinary care at Duke, understanding that, and then how you would see it potentially translating into a community setting?
When we talked about the new agents in prostate cancer, one of the key things that we talked about is how can we better involve urologists, medical oncologists, and radiation oncologists working together. And what we've done at Duke, which we really are proud of, is about 8 years ago we started a true multidisciplinary clinic where patients who are newly diagnosed with prostate cancer, for the most part, can come in on a single setting or single day and see a urologist, a medical oncologist, and a radiation oncologist in the same clinic. Then we get together, the 3 specialists, with our research nurses and other team members, and actually discuss those patients, and then go back and give our findings to the patients, and that's worked out really well. Now, what has happened is those patients then, even though most of them have early stage disease, they've already developed a relationship with an oncologist. They've already developed a relationship with a radiation oncologist, and we found that some of those men later progress, and then they seem to be more attuned to going into a clinical trial because they've been educated about it. We also do some other multi-D clinics for advanced disease and PSA-only recurrence, and again, we found that involving the multiple specialists together has been beneficial. Plus, it's beneficial to us as clinicians because we get to know our colleagues better, we get to know how they think, we're more comfortable working with them, and so the byproduct has been a better working relationship in patients who we don't see in the multi-D clinic, who then I can get on the phone and call my partner in medical oncology at a moment's notice, and is a good collegial relationship.
Skip, another way to look at multidisciplinary approaches is the interface between the practitioner and the researcher. And you have a research institute with people that do mostly research and do clinical trial work, and you also have are part of a very successful large practice that takes care of a lot of patients. How do you do that multidisciplinary piece between your clinical researchers and your clinicians?
A great question, because it's clearly a challenge to stay abreast of the current information. For our physicians to be aware of the difference between the next PI3 kinase inhibitor or the next mTOR inhibitor and what might be a totally different biologic is quite the challenge. We have a continual ongoing educational process with those physicians, try to have the nurses have access to that information. With dedicated staff, research nurse separate from the clinic nurse to assist that physician has been key. And then in addition, trying to do things electronically so that they can pull up with portal technology, just with our EMR, look on it and have a little bit of information. Tough to expect the community oncologist to go into a room and talk about a patient, with a patient about a clinical trial and not have some basic education about the product. So you've hit on the key point. How are we going to get the essential information out there to all of our colleagues so that they can do the best thing for their patient?
Thanks. And how in Duke, the setting you mentioned about doing that is an enormous investment on the part of those practitioners, because it's not efficient necessarily for 3 doctors to be waiting there for a patient.
Right.
How do you see that translating into the community? What lessons can community oncologists take away, if not using that exact structure? How do we work together? Because clearly we're getting to a point where diseases, as Skip says, are getting more complicated. The molecular characteristics, the fact that as each of the disciplines improves, there's a niche for radiation and surgery and metastatic disease. There may be a niche for chemotherapy prior to surgery. How do we bring it together? What are your thoughts on how we do that in the community setting?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very tough question because we've also done some financial analysis on our model, and the challenge is you take 3 high-powered specialists and essentially lock them away for a whole clinic session, which is basically a 5-hour period, and we typically see 6 patients during that 5-hour session. The patients love it. The families love it. The clinicians, when they're doing that, love it because they're interacting. Our administrators, not so much, and our bosses, not so much, because we're not generating the RVUs during those sessions. And that's something that we need to, unfortunately, talk about openly and honestly. But I will say for the urologist is, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, is that, you know, the urologists were way enamored with the robot, and they did these robotic prostatectomies. They took a lot extra time. The reimbursement wasn't much different. They didn't think about that then because it was new technology, it was sexy, and they were willing to give up that extra time and weren't thinking about so much reimbursement. I wish they would put that effort to think about clinical trials and multidisciplinary care for cancer, and if they even had part of that mindset, we wouldn't have any problem.
What about the budgets for clinical trials? That's a big issue, and how are you addressing that, both with pharma and with the government?
So the budgets for clinical trials is key. I think that the idea of doing the budget correctly, for every reason, if we all pay our part, so we try to carefully analyze the budget so that Medicare and the insurers are paying what would be routine standard of care, and then they're saving on not paying for the things that aren't part of it, and then having the pharmaceutical companies be able to spend their dollars on the portions of the trial that really are for research purposes primarily. The other part of it, which is a challenge, is to get the sites that are active. So the biggest cost to us is a site or group of physicians where a trial's open and they're not participating. So, you know, that's a key cost driver there. There are certain things that still have to be done with regard to regulatory and oversight, that having an inactive site with an active clinical trial is a money loser.
And I think in this era where clinical trial revenue is difficult and all revenue is difficult, we're no longer in a situation where the practice can support using chemotherapy drug revenue, a losing clinical trial. So I would agree with you that the sites have to right-size their research departments, make sure they take trials that they can achieve and be successful with, both for their network partners like Sarah Cannon or Acorn, as well as for them, or they can't stay in existence.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you both for your comments. It was
fantastic.
Thank you.